Good evening. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about decluttering your mind with the use of books. I'm going to be thinking about which books are the best for decluttering your own brain. And I'd love to know if you have books which you find are particularly useful for decluttering your brain. I'm going to be talking about fiction, but I know that there are a lot of non-fiction self-help type books which are particularly great on decluttering physically and mentally. But I'm going to mostly be talking about fiction because that is my speciality. I love to cure all things through reading novels and great stories. And I'm particularly interested in this topic because I feel like I am a bit of a hoarder. I have my friends and relatives will know I'm very bad at saying no to anything that's offered to me. And whenever I'm confronted with what other people might think is junk, I tend to want to take it home with me and give it a use. And thus my house gets full of unwanted objects and I have a terrible need to declutter. And I have actually done a YouTube session, which you can find on my YouTube channel, all about hoarding and being a hoarder. And that actually has lots of excellent book recommendations all about hoarders. And some of those books I am going to mention this evening as well, because they're very good for putting you off being a hoarder. And some of those books have actually been particularly helpful for me trying to stop my own hoarding tendencies. So I'm going to start off though by talking about some of the books which I think are particularly great for taking your mind to a place of calm and a place which is going to declutter you. So I'm thinking about the type of books that are the equivalent of going under a cold shower, perhaps jumping into a very cold lake in Finland, or a book that's maybe a bit like diving into an azure Greek sea. So that's the kind of effect that I'm hoping these books are going to give to your brain. Imagine that feeling of diving into a cold sea and instantly feeling so much more alert, awake, and unable to have your mind full of useless clutter. That's what we're looking for in these books this evening. So the first one that I want to mention is exactly, I feel, the perfect type of book to have that effect, which is a book called Snow by Maxence Fermin, which is a very beautiful, small, lovely little book, which is all about Japanese haiku and snow, hence the title. And it's a very lovely, short, easy read. You can see that all the writing is quite spaced out, which in itself is very calming as a reading opportunity because your brain is instantly not feeling cluttered by a book that's incredibly dense and full of type. These things do make a difference. And it also has many haiku running through it. And these haiku are incredibly calming and beautiful and thought-provoking. I'm going to read you a little bit to give you a hint of what it's like. This is chapter 3, I think, and it starts with a haiku. Every chapter does start with a haiku. So cold, the white petal I bring to my lips. And that's by Soseki, a Japanese haiku writer. There are 5 things you can say about snow. It is white. It freezes nature and covers it. It is always changing. It is slippery. It turns itself into water. But Yuko's father had nothing good to say about snow. For him, this strange passion his son had developed was making the winter seem even more hostile. It is white, so it is invisible, and does not deserve to exist. It freezes nature and covers it. Such arrogance to turn a living thing into a statue of ice. It's always changing. Well, then, it can't be trusted. It's slippery, and who enjoys slipping over in the snow? It turns itself into water, true, and then it floods us during the thaw. Yuko, on the other hand, saw 5 different characteristics, and each appealed to a different aspect of his artistic nature. It is white, like a poem of great purity. It freezes nature and covers it, making every landscape a painting. It is always changing, like a piece of calligraphy, for there are 10,000 ways to shape the word snow. It is slippery, so it is a dance. For the snow, we all become dancers, keeping our balance like tightrope walkers. It turns itself into water. Therefore, it is music. For in the springtime, it turns rivers and streams into symphonies of white flowing notes. So it is all of this to you, asked the monk, and much more. That night, Yuko's father realized that haiku alone would not be enough to fill the eyes of his son with the beauty of snow. But this is a really lovely book, which is a romance between a young man and a young woman. It's also very much a celebration of snow and a celebration of haiku. And it is one of the most purifying and calming and decluttering books that you can read. So I'd fully recommend that. Another one which I do frequently talk about, so people that have come here often will know The Man Who Planted Trees by Jean Giono, which is a French, very short book, which I must get a copy of to show you next time. I keep giving my copies away because it's such a beautiful little book. It's a little bit like this one in form, but it's even more gorgeous because it actually has woodcuts in it too. So that's The Man Who Planted Trees, and it's all about a man who's come back from the war in France, and Jane knows that one. Excellent. And he has been shell shocked. He's been very traumatized by the war. He's got PTSD, and he decides to plant trees as a way of overcoming his anxiety. And essentially, he just goes around the land where he lives, which has been ravaged by war as well, and he plants acorns into the soil and thus brings new life out of the ravaged land. And it's a very beautifully written book. It's very simple, it's very short, and it also has the lovely woodcuts. So that's another fabulously calming and decluttering kind of book. And I think the kind of books that I'm talking about tonight have to be quite uncomplicated because you want to have a nice empty mind with only one story in it, which is what you get from The Man Who Planted Trees. It's a very simple, basic story. And Snow is also a very simple story, although it does have different threads weaving through it, with the monk going on a journey through the mountains and a trapeze artist being frozen in the snow, which is another rather wonderful image in that book. Another one that I wanted to mention, I think a common theme tonight is going to be nature, because when you think about decluttering your mind, people very frequently imagine doing that within nature, going for long walks, going for walks by the sea, contemplating nature. All of these things are very calming and soothing and decluttering of unwanted thoughts. And there's many fabulous books which are all about nature. One of my favourites is My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, which is a children's book. Again, unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it because I've given it away because it's so good. It's one of those books you want to give to everyone you know, adults and children. And that is about a boy who is really fed up with living in his New York apartment with his 7 siblings. And he's only 13, but he says to his parents, I'm going to go and live on my own on a mountain far away. So he goes off with a little backpack, and his parents don't mind. And off he goes to a place where his grandparents had a farm, so he's not going into completely the unknown. And he, in a very realistic and believable way, surprisingly enough, actually creates a home for himself in the woods on his side of the mountain, which is in the middle of nowhere, somewhere in New York State. I'm not quite sure where it actually is. And he hollows himself a home out of a tree, which is already partly hollowed. And he actually has a rather wonderful chamber within the tree. And it's very beautifully described. It's all about how he survives through the summer and then the winter, how he catches fish, makes lots of mistakes initially because he doesn't know how to light fires because he's lived in New York all his life. And he actually goes down from the mountain into the local library and reads up on things like how to catch fish. So he then makes his way much more effectively, and he eventually gets frozen into this tree which gets iced over in the winter. And he also befriends a peregrine falcon, which helps him to catch prey in order to survive. So it's all actually very believable. This is My Side of the Mountain by Jean Craighead George, and it's a very soothing, calming, decluttering kind of book because, of course, the boy, whose name is Sam, has to survive with very little in his life. Ben, great to see you. I wonder if you've ever read My Side of the Mountain. I think you would actually love it. It's such a good book, and it is very decluttering. It takes you to a very calm place where you're going to have no intrusive thoughts at all. So that is definitely a very meditative kind of book. That leads me rather neatly to another quite similar kind of read, but a very grown-up version, which is Overstory by Richard Powers, which is a bit of a great big hefty tome. And I must admit it rather contradicts my earlier statement that when you're reading a decluttering book, you want to read one that's uncomplicated, because in a way this book is complicated. It has 5 different strands of the story that flow together, but it's written in a very unconfusing way, which, for lack of putting it in a more poetic fashion, because the first few chunks of the story are told from different viewpoints, and the very first one is told from the viewpoint of a tree itself. Jane, you're saying that you have read this. I'd be curious if you've enjoyed it. Let us know, because I do know that some people find it a little bit off-putting. I have had some readers telling me that they feel it's slightly overwritten. I think it's very poetic and beautiful, and very much a compelling read that takes you into the mind of trees. So one of the veins of the story is that it's a story told by a tree. You're actually within the consciousness of the tree. Kate, Jane, I'm glad to see that you have read it and did like it. And it does have lovely descriptions of trees, which is true. And there's also several other very compelling characters within the book, one of whom is a games designer, and he gets paralyzed quite early on in life because he falls out of a tree. That's not a terrible spoiler, I hope. But he then becomes gradually obsessed with trees, and he does things to the world of games which are quite fascinating, and becomes part of the system that's trying to save the ecosystem. And this is very much a book that makes you want to get involved as an eco warrior and attempt to save the world of trees and nature. It's all very much set in the world of the redwoods, And there's one section in it which is particularly memorable and beautiful, and it's the one that always remains in my head and is the story that is most calming and decluttering for your own mind, which is about some eco activists who actually go and live in the canopy of redwood trees in a forest in California, and they live there for 2 years in order to stop these trees being cut down. And you are completely living the life with them, and they live in a way in this world of perfection because they're up in the canopy, totally living with nature, and these incredibly beautiful descriptions of the leaves and the bugs and the birds surrounding them. But at the same time, we know that they're also being threatened by the people down at the base of the tree who want to cut down these magnificent, awesome trees. And it's a really passionate plea for us to stop cutting down the trees and actually think about what we're doing to the planet. And also, it's a plea to keep the oxygen going and to stop our carbon footprint and so on. And it does have some very dark moments. It's actually at times a very sad book. And I do know that some readers have found it a bit of a struggle because it is long and it is a bit at times going off into different digressions, but it's really well worth persevering with, and it all comes to a very brilliant and satisfying conclusion. So anyone that wants a little bit more of a challenging read should definitely read The Overstory by Richard Powers, which is also an utterly decluttering read because it takes you into those canopies, into those branches, and literally it takes you into the very inner being of the tree itself. Colleen, you've been to the Redwoods. That's amazing. I really want to go. I've never been. And I completely am very envious because having read about it, I feel like I've experienced it, but it must be amazing to actually see it. Floss, great to see you here. I wonder if you have any recommendations of books that take you into a place of calm and being decluttered in your brain. Let us know if you do. So as we speak, I'm remembering other books that I want to talk about and realizing time is going to pass too quickly. But I'm going to mention next Perfect Lives by Polly Sampson, which is a collection of short stories which came to mind to me as stories which take you into a place of calm. And this very much does follow my earlier suggestion that it's a book which is quite uncomplicated, even though it's a collection of short stories, because they all weave together with a common thread, which is that there's a piano tuner who comes into each story. And it also happens to be set quite a lot in Brighton, because a piano tuner, who is the hero who comes into all the stories, is going around Brighton, going into different people's houses. And each of the stories tells you the tale of one of the pianos that he goes to tune and the people that he meets in that flat or house or residence. And they're all very different people. But the combination of Polly Sampson's really perfectly tuned prose and the fact that it's about a piano tuner and music make this book incredibly calming and lovely and beautiful to read. And I would really recommend that as a book that declutters your brain by taking you into one place of calm and taking you into a world of music. Because actually, that's another thread that is common to the idea of books that declutter your mind, are books that take you into a world of music, because people reading about music are taken into that harmonious place which soothes the soul and declutters the mind. That's Perfect Lives by Polly Sampson. And I'm not really talking about these in any particular order, so I am jumping around rather a lot from book to book. We've talked a bit about the books that take you into places of nature, such as Overstory and My Side of the Mountain, but I now want to leap to a 1984 Booker Prize winner, which is The Bone People by Kerry Hume, which is another book that totally came to mind as a decluttering kind of book because it's all about a woman who is also called Kerry, intriguingly, so like the author, so maybe it is a bit of an autobiographical kind of novel, who lives in a very remote place all on her own in a house that is like a tower. So I'll just read you a little summary of the book. In a tower on the New Zealand sea lives Carowind Holmes, part Maori, part European, asexual and aromantic, an artist estranged from her art, a woman in exile from her family. One night, her solitude is disrupted by a visitor, a speechless, mercurial boy named Simon, who tries to steal from her and then repays her with his most precious possession. As Carowind succumbs to Simon's feral charm, she also falls under the spell of his Maori foster father, Joe, who rescued the boy from a shipwreck and now treats him with an unsettling mixture of tenderness and brutality. So it's a bizarre story, which to you might sound like it wouldn't be a calming or decluttering kind of book. But there's something about the way it's written, it's very magical, it's quite flowing, and it changes its viewpoint quite a lot. So you have first person narrative and you also have third person narrative, and it doesn't really warn you which way it's going. But despite all that, it is a very easy and compelling read, and we are completely sucked into the world of this strange woman, Carowind, who lives in a tower. And later on in the book, she creates another house which is in the shape of a shell. And it's kind of all about solitude. It's all about what happens when your solitude is um, knocked to one side by the unexpected. And it's clearly very much reflecting the author's own preoccupations, but it is a great book which takes you into this Maori world and coastal area of New Zealand, which is very beautiful and very wild. And I would utterly recommend it as a book, which I think would really wash out your clutter from your brain and take you into a new adventure which will linger with you forever. So I read that book probably about 30 years ago at a guess. And I still remember the feeling it gave me, which was a feeling of great calm. So it does have extreme emotions within it, but overall, it's a book that leaves you feeling decluttered. And that's what I'm trying to um, prescribe to you this evening, books that will declutter your brain. And as I go along, I'm just looking for comments. Do tell me if you have any particular books that you think are really great for decluttering your brain or calming your soul. One of my favourites, which Susan and I actually wrote about in the novel Cure, is Shane by Jack Schaefer. So that's a book which was actually written in 1949, and the story is set in 1989 in Wyoming, and it's narrated by a homesteader's son called Bob. So the story is told by a boy who's about 12, and it tells the story of a man called Shane who comes into their lives who's an unknown rider. And that is the original title of the book. Intriguingly, it was going to be called The Unknown Rider, but then it was changed to Shane. And I think there has been a film about it. I'm sure some of you will have seen it. It's one of those books which I think is essential reading if you live in America, And actually, we were given it to read in my teens at school, but people tend not to have heard of it so much nowadays. But I'm going to read to you what Susan and I wrote about it in the novel Cure, because we have it in the novel Cure um, as a cure for panic attack. Here we go. There is only one thing more frightening than thinking you might be about to have a panic attack, and that is having the panic attack. Of course, knowing this and worrying about it makes the possibility of having the panic attack even more likely. Those caught up in this chicken and egg situation need to keep a flask of literary tranquility to hand and take a long, slow draft, either by reading or quietly reciting passages committed to memory whenever you're in a panic that you might panic. Do it often enough, and in time, just the title alone will have your heart rate abating. The novel for the job is Shane. Shane rides into the valley dressed in black. When he politely asks for water for himself and his horse, all three members of the Starrett family are drawn to him, for he exudes something powerful and mysterious. They persuade him to stay with them, offering him work as a temporary farmhand. Even though it's clear that farming is not his trade, it becomes rapidly apparent that Shane is the essence of calm. A man of few words, he has a strong sense of justice. Although his strength and power would easily overwhelm another man, he clearly holds no truck with aggression. He keeps his gun under his pillow rather than on his belt, as other men do. The first thing Shane does when he comes to live with the Starrett family is to take an axe to the ironwood stump in the yard that's been niggling at Joe Starrett ever since he first cleared the land. The stump is big, big enough to serve dinner on to a family twice their size. But as Shane cuts it, the clear ringing sound of steel on wood strikes young Bob as no sound ever has before, filling him with warmth. At that moment, Shane becomes the hero that Bob needed in order to grow up straight inside as a boy should. For Bob needed an example from outside his family unit, someone he could emulate. Determined, graceful, just, with sorrows we know nothing of, and who will always do the right thing. Shane is that mentor, and not just for Bob, but also for his father, Joe. Install this fierce, hard gem of a man in your heart. Your blood will pump as steadily and calmly as that clear, ringing axe on the obstinate stump. Let panic be the tree stump you know you can conquer. So that's Shane by Jack Schaefer, which is a book which we have as a cure for a panic attack. But it's actually a book which does have this tremendous sense of calm and purpose and of being able to overcome difficulties. It is a simple tale. It doesn't have much complexity. It's a book that a teenager has read and probably had to read for school purposes, uh, which does have a lot of analysis, but it's one that you can take its message to heart quite easily. And it is definitely a very calming and beautifully written, simple book. So that was Shane by Jack Schaefer. I then would also like to recommend, what was the one that I was going to recommend? Oh, yes, Bel Canto by Anne Patchett, which anyone that's read it, you might be surprised in a way to think that it's a book that would clear your head. But I feel that this book very much acts like a dive into a beautiful azure sea, which gives you a shock and makes you feel awake, alive, and unable to think about anything other than the fact that you've just jumped into the sea. This is a book about an opera singer who goes to an ambassador's house in an unnamed country in South America to sing from her repertoire for his birthday. But when she's on the verge of singing, some terrorists come into the very large stateroom that they're singing in and they declare a state of kidnap, and all of the people in the room are held as hostages, and the whole book is about that hostage scene. So it starts off, I think the whole thing takes place in that very room. So it could be a very claustrophobic book, but it's actually an incredibly beautiful and, in a strange way, uplifting book, because the heroine, who is the bel canto of the title, is uh, in some strange way able to bring people together through the beauty of her voice and the power of her music. And that's not giving anything away, because there's quite a lot of major ups and downs in this book. It is quite dramatic at times, so it's possibly not for the faint of heart. It's also been made into a film. The book is so much better. You definitely have to read the book. And it is a book that completely clears your head and leaves you feeling renewed. And it also revives your faith in the power of art and love and music. So, all in all, this is a pretty powerful medicine of a novel, which I would completely and utterly recommend. Another book that I wanted to mention, which I don't think I've got to hand, but I'm just going to have a very quick look. Hold on 1 second, because I might be able to find it very quickly in my somewhat cluttered room. Can I find it? Maybe I can't. It's not coming to hand. Sorry about that. So the book that I was looking for was Life, a User's Manual by Georges Perec, which is one of my favourite novels of all time. It's very big and fat, which makes it all the more frustrating that I can't find it. And in a way, it's the essence of clutter as a book, because it's a book that all takes place in a block of flats. It tells the story of every single apartment in this block of flats, which is in Paris. And it tells you about almost every living thing in the block of flats, and also every inanimate object in the block of flats. So it has a huge, endless collection of lists within the book, lists of the possessions in the people's homes. It's also a book all about puzzles, and it's a book all about chess, because every chapter is written in such a way that Georges Perec is making a chess move with his writing when he tells the story. Hooray! Hells Bells loves Perec. Fantastic. And isn't it the most incredible book? Life, a User's Manual, La Vie, Mode d'Emploi, written in French originally. And it is a very inspiring, strange, bizarre book that takes you on many different diversions in its 99 chapters. The reason that I think it's great for this subject of decluttering your brain through reading is that it takes you on this incredible journey when you create puzzles and unravel the puzzles, that actually, in a way, fills you up with clutter and then declutters you by the end of the book. You have to read it to understand it. But it is one of those books that when you get to the end, you feel completely uncluttered in a strange and brilliant way. And he is a writer that plays games with you constantly. He was in this group of writers called Oulipo, along with Italo Calvino and others who all like to play these mathematical games. And Perec is also famous for having written the book in which he didn't use the letter E at all. He took out the letter E. In English, it's translated into a void, and miraculously, it was translated into English as well, without using the letter E throughout the whole book, and that's because his amazing translator, Belloc, was able to be insanely clever and translate a whole book without the use of the letter E. And the reason that Perec wrote that book was because his mother had died in a Nazi camp, and so his book in French it means the absence. It's the absence of the letter E. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression. So, Life a User's Manual is a book that you have to definitely read, and it's very much a decluttering kind of book. So, I'm going to move shortly on to the second section of this evening, which is about books that actually do help you declutter physically. But I wanted to mention a couple of recommendations from you out there. So Heather recommended earlier this evening for Calm the lovely Alexander McCall Smith, in her words, and she said all his books are glorious and calming, which is very true. Alexander McCall Smith, who wrote the wonderful number one Lady Detectives Agency, they're really gorgeously calming, lovely books. There's something incredibly comforting about reading those books because you always know that there's going to be a satisfying ending. And although occasionally there might be dastardly deeds, they always come right in the end. They're very um, comforting, calming, lovely books which you can rely on. I think that's what we love about McCall Smith. You can rely on him to take you on a really great journey. But they're also very humorous and excellent reads. Then another recommendation was from Vic, who recommended John Buchan's novel John McNabb, which is a book that I haven't yet read, and I would really like to because it sounds brilliant. So John Buchan, famous for his brilliant novel 39 Steps, love it. In 1925, John Buchan published his second most famous novel, John McNabb, which is about three high-flying men, a barrister, a cabinet minister, and a banker, who are suffering from boredom. They concoct a plan to cure it. They inform three Scottish estates that they will poach from each 2 stags and a salmon in a given time. They sign collectively as John McNabb and await the responses. So this is a light and entertaining novel which is all about the three men's capers as they gallivant across crags and gullies, hunting deer and salmon, whilst deceiving hapless landowners. So it's a book that can be described as a bit of a romp, but that, I must say, sounds like a really perfect antidote to the world. And Vic also recommended Dorothy Sayers' excellent Harriet Vine, is it Vane or Vine? I can't remember now, books, which are really fantastic detective novels, which I would also totally recommend. Um, I'd also like to thank Jane for a brilliant recommendation of a children's book, which is called Epaminondas Tries to Be Brave by Egan Constance, which is about a little boy who smashed a plate by accident but was honest and then told his mother that he'd smashed the plate. And she was so proud of him for being so brave that she totally made him feel brilliant for being so brave and clever as to come and tell her. So he then went and smashed all the other plates so that he could be really a really good brave boy and tell his mother all about smashing the plates. And that came to Jane's mind earlier on when I was asking for recommendations as the idea of decluttering, because she was obviously picturing all those smashed plates all over the kitchen. But I feel that it's one of those great antidotes to clutter, because it's a book that describes clutter in all its depth. And it makes me think of the book A Squash and a Squeeze by Julia Donaldson, which is another fantastic children's book, which works as a kind of antidote in a similar way, because that's all about a house that gets absolutely stuffed with animals, goats, people, rabbis, all kinds of things until it's squeezing at the edges. It's a squash and a squeeze. And then as all those things slowly leave, everyone feels completely relieved again. And I feel like this book, recommended by Jane, Epaminondas Tries to Be Brave, by Egan Constance, which, by the way, has a really fab cover as well, is one of those books that will make you feel decluttered after you read it, partly because of all those images of smashed plates, which I imagine are inside the book, but I haven't actually read it. But it just sounds like a fantastic story. So I'm now just going to mention a couple of books which actually make you want to declutter physically, because they're all about hoarding. And as I was saying earlier, I did do an evening devoted to hoarders in literature, and you can find that on my YouTube channel, which is Ella Bear2 on YouTube. Do subscribe to my channel, by the way, because then you will be able to get regular weekly sessions if you miss them. You can always find them on YouTube. Um, so there's a whole host of excellent recommendations on that channel, which I've been doing now for the past couple of years, started in lockdown. So there was one book I particularly wanted to talk about, which is The House We Grew Up In by Lisa Jewell, which is a book that I found incredibly disturbing and close to the bone, because it's all about a woman who is a terrible hoarder. Obviously, I haven't reached that stage, but I can imagine it. That's the horrifying idea. When you read a book like that, it makes you feel like you could be that hoarder. Nonny, great to see you. I don't imagine that you're a hoarder at all, and I hope that you have a very decluttered brain. But this book, The House We Grew Up In by Lisa Jewell, is all about a woman who's a hoarder who becomes one because she's unhappy, and she starts to collect things. It's really, she collects them for nostalgia's sake. She collects all the shiny wrappers of Easter eggs, and she collects her children's drawings. She can't throw anything away. But then she also starts collecting things from the equivalent of Poundland in the 1980s, probably Woolworths, where she used to go and get kind of 10 little zippy bags to keep the vegetables in, just in case she ever needed them. And her whole house becomes full of all these little things, just in case she ever needs them, and they're really cheap, and she feels like they're a fabulous bargain. And so she hoards all these piles and piles of things, and slowly her children grow up and realize that this is not a normal situation, and they move out, and they leave her in this house where she's getting more and more completely surrounded by stuff. And I won't tell you what happens, but it is a really good read. And there's another one on similar lines called The Hoarder by Jess Kidd, which is another really interesting book about this same issue, about an underpaid carer called Maud Drennan, who is also an unintentional psychic, who becomes a dog's body to this ancient belligerent man, Cathal Flood, who is a hoarder, who lives now in a filthy, once grand home. And in that book, in a way, it's a much more magical realist kind of book, because there's a bit of psychic involvement going on, and you do get deep into the heart of hoarding in that book too. And while we're on the theme, I would love to mention another of my favourites, which is The Trauma Cleaner by Sarah Krasnostein, which is about a woman who cleans up after people have had terrible traumas. She goes into their houses, and this is a memoir, although it's actually written by a journalist on behalf of the actual trauma cleaner. It's all a bit of a complicated story, but it is based on a true story. And essentially, this trauma cleaner is someone who um, has their own quite interesting and deep personal issues. And she has created a job for herself, which is to go in and clear up after bad situations such as suicide or people who've been hoarding for years and who are now living in squalor. And this lady, um, who's called Sandy Pankhurst, she goes in to clear up. And it's actually an incredibly positive read, which sounds surprising for such a subject because it's all about the way that our heroine, the the lady who is the trauma cleaner, overcomes these awful situations and is highly practical about them. And you don't get any of the gore, you don't get any grim details. You just see her being an amazing person and going in and cleaning up. But what's also really interesting about it is her entire backstory, because she was actually born male in Australia in the 1960s, or even born in the 50s, I think. And she grows up slowly realizing that she is a woman, and she has to go through a lot of trauma herself in order to have a sex change at a time when it was actually pretty difficult and unusual to go about changing sex. But she did succeed, and she also has a lot of health issues. But all in all, it's a book that's incredibly uplifting, which seems surprising. And it's also a book that is all about decluttering. So it is a memoir, and it actually leaves you feeling as if your mind has been decluttered and as if you might go forth and declutter your own home. Um, on the non-fiction front, there's a couple of books that have been mentioned to me. Jane earlier on was mentioning The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle. Tolle, never know how to pronounce that. Sorry, Eckhart. Which is a book I haven't read myself, and I know a lot of people have, and a lot of people love it. The Power of Now. Have you read it? Let me know if you have. And Jane was saying earlier that it's a book that she has found incredibly positive, and it's a book that has helped her to face various difficulties, and a sense of anxiety in the face of disorder. I hope that I'm not putting the words in your mouth, Jane, but that was what I was gleaning from you. And I have often had that book recommended to me by my own bibliotherapy clients. There's also, of course, Marie Kondo, who has an entire industry all about decluttering. And I'm sure that many of you have either read her book or seen her in action on TV, Decluttering. And her essential message is to throw anything out of your room and out of your house that does not spark joy. And that seems like pretty good advice to me. And there's another non-fiction, which is Goodbye to Things by Fumio Sasaki, who is not any particular life coach or influencer kind of person like Marie Kondo, but he's just a regular guy who wants to say goodbye to stuff that he doesn't need. And that's been recommended to me as well as a really excellent decluttering book. So, as you know, I'm all about fiction, and I would always go for the fiction first for decluttering your mind. And this is the book that I started with, Snow by Maxence Fermin, which I think is a really great book to take you into a place of calm, purity, whiteness, snow. And if I was to choose one of all the books that I've mentioned tonight, I would go with this one. as a book to declutter your brain. But I wonder if you have any books that you want to mention or tell me about. Cam, what do you read when you're needing to declutter your brain? I wonder. Let me know. And I can't see comments on Facebook. I do have this slight issue with Facebook that I never manage to see the comments. But if there's anyone that wants to send me comments later, feel free. I'm going to end on that merry note, but do check out my YouTube channel. I'm going to be putting this up there later tonight or tomorrow morning. You can find a whole host of fascinating topics there, from how to declutter your library to great books about trees, great books about the sea. Um, Good evening, Cam. Lovely to see you here. So yeah, do check out my YouTube channel, and also consider booking a bibliotherapy session. You can have a personal bibliotherapy session with me, which takes between 45 minutes and an hour. I find out all about you, your reading habits, what you like to read, what you don't like to read, and I then prescribe you books which will be the perfect books for you to read at this time in your life, because I also find out all about what you're doing in your life right now. So if you're interested in having a bibliotherapy session, do drop me an email on ella@ellabeartoo.com. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, and come back next week. And do let me know of any topics that you would like me to cover in these bibliotherapy sessions. Thanks so much for coming, and goodbye for now. Good night. See you soon.